So welcome to everyone. I'm glad that you joined, and I hope you will stay with us for the next 1.5 hours. In this event, we basically want to kind of reflect on the outcomes of two landmark conferences we've been having this year. The first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, in Vienna in June, and then not long after we had the review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, which took place in New York in August. So we'll have a closed panel discussion until, let's say, 8 p.m. And then I'll open it up for questions, which you can already start to type in the chat. I'll ask you to please, if you want to make my life as a moderator a bit easier, also type in to whom you want to address your question. I'll pick up on them and I'll pose them to the speakers once we open up the panel. What I want to do in the closed panel discussion is, first of all, focus on really, okay, what did these conferences do for prospects of disarmament and nuclear reductions? And we'll have a look at the current disarmament environment, which, well, let's be honest, could be better. And then, of course, also I want to make a little bit use of the fact that we have a truly fantastic and international panel here today. And we want to see, okay, what parts are actually missing in the international conversation about arms control and disarmament. And we hope to identify like quite a few blind spots here, maybe. So first, let me probably introduce our speakers, and I'll start with Bedi Racule. She's the ecumenical enabler for climate justice at the Pacific Conference of Churches. Then we have Olamide Samuel with us, who's a research associate in nuclear politics at the University of Leicester, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. And we have with us Pavel Podvig, who's a senior researcher at the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at UNIDIR. UNIDIR is the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. Welcome to all of you. I'm super glad that you're with us today. And actually, the great thing is I don't need to tell anyone what happened at these conferences because you guys attended at least one of the conferences each. And I'll ask you in your introductory remarks to please kind of like walk us through your own personal conference experience. So how was that for you? And reflect a little bit on what were the achievements, but also what were the problems or, well, maybe also failures of the conference you attended. And we'll start with Olamide. Over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Franziska. So I'm going to be reflecting on one of the conferences, which is the nuclear ban meeting of state parties, because that was the only one I was able to attend, even though I had made efforts to be able to attend the meeting of state parties or the review conference of the NPT in the US, due to some barriers to entry, which have to do with the visa regimes. I wasn't able to attend the NPT. So I think that's one piece of feedback to start off my remarks. So I'm going to focus only on the nuclear ban MSP. Now, my experience of the MSP could be summarized broadly speaking as witnessing the impact of diversity on nuclear politics. So I found one MSP to be particularly unique when compared to other high-level nuclear conferences of this type, notably because of the presence of young and diverse activists who were freely interacting with diplomats, representatives, and academics. And I think this is actually quite unique in the nuclear policy field. Additionally, because these young people were not just a noticeable audience during the deliberations, but instead, these young people actively furnished diplomatic negotiations with their immersive testimonies, presentations, and statements, and they were active participants in the field whose voices were emphatically heard. And I think the impact of this diversity of viewpoints was so important because it actually facilitated and sustained a remarkable level of optimism, forward thinking, and resolve throughout the MSP. This was regardless of the particularly terrible international environment that the MSP was taking place in. I found that there was more accountability for the future state of nuclear affairs, than there were apologies for the mistakes of the past. And this is what happens when you let young people take center stage. Now, the problems that emerged in one MSP were many. As I said before, the conference took place in a particularly challenging international environment that was characterized by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the increasing importance of nuclear weapons in the doctrines of nuclear weapon states and their security alliances, and the general return to great power competition that we're witnessing in international politics. These developments all contributed to creating a challenging environment which had to be sensitively navigated by state parties in the pursuit of a successful outcome of the meeting. More specifically, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the most important influence on the very rationale, meaning, and urgency of one MSP. On one hand, it threatened the internal ideological cohesion of nuclear ban supporting states. Unexpectedly, the issue of whether and how to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine actually threatened the consensus of ideology that had been taken for granted for so long. Generally speaking, Western countries, regardless of whether they were observer states or state parties, were more willing to condemn Russian aggression when compared to many of their global South counterparts. And we can see this subtle contestation when we take a look at the general opening remarks made by various states in one MSP. Some states explicitly called out Russia for its nuclear threats, while others prefer to just highlight a generally deteriorating security environment. And I think this division was primarily due to the current and historical, economic, and ideological ties that some states have with Russia. However, the requirement of a united front against all forms of nuclear violence prevailed, and the MSP declaration condemned all threats of nuclear violence without instigating an exceptionalist discourse where only Russia was viewed as the nuclear problem in the outcome document. Member states also made key decisions in Vienna to move the ban treaty forward. We shouldn't forget that they adopted deadlines, concrete deadlines, for the destruction and removal of nuclear weapons by future members. MSP also established working groups and national points of contact to advance key provisions of the treaty, which we would delve into in further discussion. Finally, MSP agreed to set up a scientific advisory group to support the treaty's implementation. So in summary, I believe that the MSP actually demonstrated that a phenomenal amount of determination and resolve exists amongst a majority of states to ensure that nuclear weapons become a thing of the past. And I look forward to seeing how this process evolves over time. Thank you very much. And over to you, Franziska.
Well, thank you so much. You kind of like talked also about the whole issue of, how one MSP dealt with the whole issue of nuclear threats. I find that super interesting, and we'll definitely talk about this later a bit more. But first of all, I want to hand over to Bedi. Go ahead.
Thank you, Franziska. Good morning, everyone from Suva, Fiji, where it is currently 5 a.m. in the morning. Thank you so much to ICAN Germany for the opportunity to be on this panel and reflect on my experiences attending the first meeting of state parties in Vienna, which was the only meeting that I was able to attend. It was an honor to be present at the historic meeting, and I would also like to acknowledge ICAN for their support in getting me there this year. Thank you as well to Dr. Ola for those great remarks on the MSP. I am from the Marshall Islands, which is an atoll nation located in the North Pacific Ocean, midway between Hawaii and Australia. And to give some context to some viewers who maybe are not familiar with our nuclear testing legacy, between 1946 and 1958, the US tested 67 nuclear weapons in my birthplace, while we were under US trusteeship granted by the United Nations. It has been said that if the combined explosive power of these tests were parceled evenly over that 12-year period, it would equal 1.6 Hiroshima-sized explosions per day. Each island of ours is considered a gift, and one of those precious islands was completely incinerated off the face of the planet by a nuclear bomb. Bikini Atoll, where the largest hydrogen bomb test took place, remains in the Pacific, remains uninhabitable today. The impact of these tests on human beings in the Marshall Islands are even more horrific. Declassified documents have revealed that the testing officials deliberately left Marshallese people exposed to fallout in order to study radiation exposure on human beings. We are still riddled with high rates of cancer and other diseases, which are exacerbated by a lack of health care and other crises, including the recent pandemic and climate change. The Marshall Islands are among other nations in the Pacific who have been impacted by nuclear violence, like Kiribati and Maui, and the imminent threat of nuclear waste leaking from nuclear storage sites like the Runit Dome are of critical concern to our oceanic continent. I share all of this with you to contextualize how vital the TPNW is for our nuclear victims, especially with its provisions on victims' assistance and environmental remediation. It should be noted that while the Marshall Islands is not yet a signatory of the TPNW, they are indeed working very hard to achieve nuclear justice through compact negotiations with the US, and I have no doubt that the outcomes of the MSP are very much beneficial to my nation, who has been fighting for justice for over 70 years. The first MSP stood out to me as a conference that was inclusive and receptive to the voices of impacted communities. Thanks to the preceding ICAN Civil Society Forum and Vienna Conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, as well as various side events throughout the conference, I truly felt like all national leaders had access to ample resources and information needed to make decisions. We had honest discussions about very real and tangible issues, and I felt like my voice was heard in a place where I would normally be struggling to find a seat at the table. During the Vienna conference, I sat right in the second row next to my friend Danity, who gave her testimony amongst all of the national leaders, scientists, and members of civil society. Centering the discussions around the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons at the MSP made the goal of the meeting very clear to me. Abolish nuclear weapons for the sake of humanity and repair the damage that has been caused by them together. At the end of the meeting, our Pacific Collective praised and celebrated the Vienna Declaration and Vienna Action Plan, which set out clear actions for disarmament, including adopting sound guiding principles for actions on victims' assistance and environmental remediation, along with an international trust fund and a scientific advisory group to assist state parties. This means a lot to us. My personal experience at the conference was that it was a very great learning experience and also an eye-opening experience. Before going to the conference, I did not realize the true danger that nuclear weapons pose on all humankind. I gained so much technical knowledge, but was also so inspired by all of the people who had the courage to stand up and reveal the absurdity of nuclear weapons. One thing missing for me was the presence of nuclear-armed states and even Pacific states who should be joining these conversations. However, I am very hopeful and look forward to the development of the next MSP, and I would like to also echo the sentiments of Dr. Ola, who believed that this conference was very much a place where the discussion on disarmament was sorry, I didn't think about how to end my my intervention, but I do agree with everything that was said before me, and it was really an inspiring and great experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it speaks for itself that both of you highlighted the fact that you had the feeling, that finally, young people had the chance to participate at a nuclear conference. I really, that was quite impressive to hear from both of you. So thank you so much. Also important points that you made about the whole, issue of testing and what can be done about it, the trust fund, all of that. We'll come back to that later. Pavel, I have you next on my list as the one who will cover the NPT for us.
Thank you. Yes, I realized that I was at both meetings, although I must say that I'm not a great kind of a meeting watcher. And for the NPT, I was there for a few days and largely to attend side events. But of course, I've been following the developments and try to make sense of what happened. I think it is fair to say that there was a whole number of circumstances where let the NPT RevCon take place when it did. First, the pandemic. And everybody thought that, well, maybe it's a good thing that it's not the Trump administration that is in the White House. But then the pandemic continued, the meeting was postponed, and it was postponed to the point where it had to deal with the war in Ukraine. And I think that was definitely a great shock to the entire international system. I would say definitely to the non-proliferation and disarmament part of it. But at the same time, I think my sense from conversations that I had with diplomats, with colleagues, was that people are not yet absolutely certain about what to do with that all, and in a way, there was the sense that for this RevCon, the mood was, well, let's get it done, let's have some outcome, let's kind of do something reasonable, and then we'll pass, and then we'll have time to think and to reevaluate and maybe do something meaningful. So there was this kind of a mood for a compromise, if you will. And in the end, as far as I can tell, that this is more or less what happened, because the draft document that was prepared was not particularly strong, and there was, in fact, it appears there was a good chance that it could have been passed. But of course, as we all know, at the last moment, Russia said that it will not join the consensus, and we were left without the outcome document. At the same time, again, judging by the reaction that I've seen, it was not considered that much of a problem, in a sense that nobody was really expecting the outcome document to have a real force, because we know what happened to the past, the action plans and the steps and all that, and it appears that the power of these documents is not certain, or there are doubts about whether these documents have real power. There were, of course, and again, the fact that the meeting came that close to the adopting the document and to reaching the compromise was a good sign, and there are many good elements in this draft. Some of them, I think, my I liked the phrase that was included there, that every states would make every effort to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again. So that was, I think, a good good statement. But then again, they were writing it down at the time when one weapon state was fighting a war with a non-nuclear weapon state, and so again, there is a question as sort of how this, what kind of power these documents have. And I think to me at least, to a large extent, the problem there is rooted in the fundamental issue with the NPT, which is this divide between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. And for example, the P3, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, they put together a document on responsible practices and responsible way of handling nuclear weapons, which there is nothing wrong with that, but basically that kind of that phrase eventually made its way, and it came from this kind of rhetoric around Russia's irresponsible nuclear threats around the war in Ukraine, and then you really have to ask the question, sort of, what are there responsible nuclear threats? So there is so there is this, in my view, this is the attempt to kind of smuggle in, if you will, this idea that certain states are handling these weapons responsibly and others are not, which has been part of this whole NPT discourse for some time, I should say. We will see how this what the real outcome sort of this NPT RevCom is, because I think by that time I don't think that there is anybody is really concerned about states starting to leave the NPT. Sort of, there is, at least I haven't kind of seen that registered in any way. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if states will start kind of disengage, and we will see, as my colleague suggested, we will see how many states will come to a PrepCom meeting, and how many states will participate actively in these discussions. So at the same time, the sentiment, as again many people have noted, of course the NPT process remains the only forum, other than the UN in general, where non-weapon states could talk to weapon states, and in a way maybe try to push them in the direction of arms control, disarmament. At the same time, I don't know, maybe it is entirely possible that maybe we kind of need to reevaluate the NPT process, and to ask ourselves whether NPT is a correct, right framework for nuclear disarmament. Which I'm not saying that necessarily that it is not, but I think this is a legitimate question to ask, because again, there was in the draft, there was a commitment by the United States and Russia to continue arms control discussions. But then again, if you look at the war in Ukraine and the role that nuclear weapons play in this role, even though kind of they stay in the background, one thing that you could conclude is that arms control numbers don't necessarily matter. So it doesn't really matter if Russia has 1,500 or 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, or 100 or something. So that is not the important part of this. The important problem is that these weapons are there, and there is a certain legitimacy that is given to them, and that legitimacy, kind of as much as we would love to see all nuclear threats being responsible. No, I mean we definitely will see a lot of irresponsible nuclear threats. So that's the my few thoughts around here. Just one word maybe on the TPNW meeting, which was quite a different affair. Was really very interesting experience, and I think something that Olamide actually mentioned, the statement, it was the statement, the states parties unequivocally condemn any and all nuclear threats, which I believe was a very strong statement. And I did get, in fact, right there, people, journalists started asking, isn't it a problem that Russia wasn't mentioned there? And they said, no, that's not the problem. That's the strength of this statement, because that's exactly the right way of thinking about nuclear threats, that any and all nuclear threats should be condemned. And I think that the TPNW states parties found a very good way to address this, and I believe that this should be the message that we should try to take forward and promote and state. Because it doesn't, yeah, I mean, as bad as Russia's nuclear threats are, US or NATO nuclear threats are not any better. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Pavel. I'll actually pick up on the whole like nuclear threats / what is a responsible nuclear threat issue first. But before we start doing that, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions already, because like you follow the discussion, please put them down in the chat so that we can later on post them to our distinguished panelists. So the whole issue of nuclear threats. I wanted to, I also have like read this paper by the P3, as you said, you know, France, UK, United States, and there they try to push the REFCON to condemn irresponsible rhetoric concerning potential nuclear use intended for military coercion, intimidation, or blackmail, but not nuclear threats that serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war. So my question, probably, Olamide, you want to jump in here, because you also, you know, talked about that in your remarks. Is there such a thing as a responsible nuclear threat? And if not, I would ask you, what should be the messaging that a disarmament community should adapt? Because that's actually the, you know, that's the trend. That's like how the whole discussion about threats is evolving at the moment. So what should be the response by TPNW supporters, or more broader, the arms control community, be now that we have this distinction increasingly in the discourse?
Yes, thank you very much for driving that question my way first. Possibly because I might have the least substantive thing to say about this. But to start off with, I don't think there is anything like a responsible nuclear threat. I think the whole discourse of responsibility with regards to the retention of nuclear arsenals is something that has been increasingly peddled by the so-called English school of thought in nuclear politics, where they're operating within the ideological paradigm that nuclear weapons are somewhat natural or a thing that we have to manage and live with, and they don't entertain to any extent the thought that nuclear weapons aren't a provider of security. So it's within this normalization of nuclear weapons as a tool of foreign policy that we begin to see discourses about responsibility and irresponsibility. Oh, this is how you should use a nuclear weapon. Oh no, this one is a bit too reckless. You can't use nuclear weapons for aggression, just defense. What is interesting is that much of this English school and the P3 completely ignore historical cases where, they threatened the use of nuclear weapons offensively. If we think about the Falklands War in the 1980s, there is talk about, the ambiguous threat of the UK to use nuclear weapons in that faraway conflict. We think about the slightly less veiled nuclear threats that the US issued to Iran to Iraq in 2002, and also threats in the 1980s and 1990s all over the Middle East from Western states threatening to nuke their uranium enrichment facilities, to nuke their civilian nuclear infrastructure as a way of carrying out so-called kinetic counterproliferation. So, are these uses responsible? Is it responsible to threaten to use a nuclear weapon to stop a state from acquiring a nuclear weapon? Is it responsible to threaten, the conventional attacks on civilian nuclear facilities in the Middle East, but somehow less responsible to do so on civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine? All of these paradoxes come from the flawed understanding that there can be a responsible use of nuclear weapons in foreign policy altogether. The second half of your question about what the disarmament community can do, I think this is one of the easiest tasks for the disarmament community, because it's very easy to call out, ridiculous and crazy ideas such as these. The double standards are very evident, where we see that the Western sort of first world countries are seen as having a different rationality compared to, say, the non-Western, non-P5 nuclear weapon states. Nuclear weapons are dangerous in everyone's hands. And I believe that, drawing this equivalence between the nuclear weapons possession of the United States under Trump and the nuclear weapon possession of the United States under Biden is important as a starting point to articulate just how ridiculous the entire thing is. I'll pause there for now and give way to the other panelists.
So I would actually leave it open to Pavel or Bedi if you want to come in on that. I have a 2 fingers by Pavel, and then next I'll also try to push it a little bit further and connect this to kind of actually the issue of nuclear justice and nuclear injustice, which is also, I think, at the heart of the work that Bedi is doing. So maybe we'll hear Pavel first, and then I'll take it over to Bedi.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think one thing that we can see, in fact, from this war and from other examples of the threats, and a couple of things actually. One is that nuclear weapons are not necessarily all that useful in providing states with security. And we could see that for example, no nuclear weapons in the world prevented North Korea, for example, from building its own nuclear weapons. So is the United States, China and Russia and others, are they more secure because they sort of they had nuclear, the United States had nuclear weapons, still there was not much they could do. So again, even if we look at the current the war in Ukraine, I mean, yes, you could make an argument that Russia's nuclear weapons kind of protect Russia, to enable this aggression. That is probably true, but one question is Russia is in any way better off today than it was 8 months ago, from security point, by any measure? I don't think you could name any measure by which Russia is in a better position now. So so in that sense, I think I would say there is a strong argument that basically Russia, and I do believe that Russia would have been much happier, much more prosperous, and much more secure country if it didn't have nuclear weapons. So so that's again, that's the security part. Now the other part is that the kind of utility, quote unquote, is also very questionable in the sense that again, we can see in this war that nuclear weapons don't have a plausible military mission. So there is not much that can be done to actually fight the actual war. What they can do, and what the nuclear weapons are good, quote unquote, for, is they could kill a lot of people. That's where they get their power. And I think that this is Franziska, to your question, sort of what can the international community, what people and states can do. I think this is kind of this is what we should try to make that message very clear, that nuclear weapons are, their only power is in killing people, and this is where they draw their power, and that this is precisely why the kind of nuclear threats should be condemned unequivocally. So that's the message there. And I think, again, back to the Vienna Declaration, I think that was basically there, and I think we should work on reinforcing that message and again making it consistent and clear.
Thanks, Pavel. To both of you, actually. Now we had kind of the systemic injustice of nuclear weapons explained by both of you. There's also past injustice by nuclear weapons, I would argue, which especially refers to, nuclear testing. And, the TPNW tries to address the whole complex of nuclear justice, I think. So, Bedi, this goes to you. Are you satisfied with the approach the TPNW takes on this? And how does your own experience, working with people affected with by nuclear weapons, how does it relate to that? And I would be just, interested, since especially I figure we have quite a bit of a German audience here, and Germany was also participating as an observer at the TPNW conference, and they signaled willingness to contribute to some sort of victim support whatsoever. And I would ask you, so what do we have to do concretely? How does victim support have to look like to be efficient? So I know quite a bit of questions to you all at once. Over to you.
Thank you, Franziska. I believe, everything that Dr. Ola and Dr. Pavel have been saying really resonate with me about our national security. And I just wanted to share first that although I don't have a very clear answer on international security discussions, as a youth, the discussions about the situation in Ukraine were very concerning to us, and even those from nuclear armed states don't feel safe at all. So security is very relative to how safe you feel, and also the the impacts of owning nuclear weapon is just another way that states benefit from colonizing the global South. You know, they produce weapons which harm our communities. They test weapons in our communities, and in the end, they benefit from the security that those weapons give, the false security that those weapons give to them, while we continue to carry the burden that they shove towards us. So, yeah, for victims assistance and remediation, I think recognizing those injustices, those imbalances is very important, first of all, to recognize the colonial injustices that are taking place within the world, and recognizing that the global South is really outnumbering those nuclear armed states who want to keep up, you know, this facade. But in terms of victims assistance, right now, whenever cancer victims in the Pacific need treatment, they often have to travel to another country where that treatment is available, and they leave behind their families, their land, their culture. There's a lot of loss that comes with migrating due to, or being displaced due to the impacts of nuclear weapons. And so not only providing cancer facilities for them would be really greatly impactful, so that they don't have to move. And it's surprising that there aren't any cancer facilities in the Marshall Islands, but also helping those who have been displaced to navigate, you know, the challenges that come with displacement. And recently, Marshallese citizens have just been granted, just last year, mandated to receive insurance. So we weren't even receiving insurance in the US. I grew up in the US as a Marshallese person that also migrated for better medical access and other opportunities, but I wasn't granted insurance after I turned 18 unless it was an emergency. So it's hard to detect any illnesses unless it's too late for us. So very simple things can be done to start addressing victims assistance. One of the other things is to address the very urgent threat of nuclear waste contamination coming from nuclear waste storage sites like the Runit Dome, which is this huge dome that it's like a crater that was dug up, and there was no protective lining put there to separate the land from the nuclear waste from the Marshall Islands and from Nevada, put into the dome and covered with concrete. And it's just sitting on this very small island, and the ocean is coming up and threatening to crack it open. And scientists have already found signs of radiation leaking from the dome. So this is not just a concern to the Marshallese people, but a very big concern to all Pacific people who depend on the ocean for their livelihood and sustenance and well-being and culture. So yeah, there are several really practical actions that we could take, and I don't know if the Marshall Islands could benefit because they are not a party of the treaty. So even addressing their membership to the treaty is very important. And I see that someone asked why they aren't a member of the TPNW. In 2020, the National Nuclear Commission put out a statement that they support the treaty and they have been involved in negotiations for the treaty, but they are still considering whether it will be beneficial to them because the provisions of the treaty don't provide enough assurance that if RMI becomes a party, they won't assume full responsibility of the Runit Dome. So that was back in 2020, and the development and the discussions are evolving now, but they are treading very carefully and making sure that their resources and time are being put into places that really truly benefit the victims. And one of those places where their time is beneficial is with negotiations for the Compact of Free Association, which we have this special relationship with the US, the compact. So that's happening right now. And yeah, one of few reasons why they haven't signed the treaty yet.
Thank you so much. I have two fingers by Pavel, please.
Yeah, just a very brief remark following to what Bedi said. And I think I wanted to say it when kind of sharing experiences from the meetings, and that was really something that struck me at the TPNW meeting, that the number of states and people affected by this history. And again, I must admit that that was largely kind of my fault, because in the sense that I didn't know that to the full extent, because coming from the kind of the Soviet Union, Russia, and working on arms control, the kind of warhead counting kind of things, sort of you don't really know that part of the history. And I do remember that when in the 90s, when Kazakhstan started protesting, or even earlier in the 80s, Kazakhstan started protesting, and that was kind of a, yes, I knew about Kazakhstan, Novozemlya, others, but again, the scale of the suffering, that was really something that clearly really surprised me, and that makes the emphasis on the kind of justice and victim assistance and remediation is actually a very important part of the TPNW process.
I'll let Olamide respond, and then Bedi again.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing this question up, and thank you, Bedi, for really highlighting the really practical barriers that are being faced today, particularly because from my point of view, beyond looking at nuclear weapons testing history in Africa, I try to also look at the vestiges of neocolonialism today, and we tend to talk about the impacts of nuclear testing and the responsibilities for those as though they were historical occurrences. But Bedi pointing out the fact that it's almost impossible to find cancer treatment in the Marshall Islands is actually very interesting, given that in much of the capitalist world, demand usually precedes supply. So if there's demand for a particular kind of treatment, it is not too it's not too surprising to think that there will be some really adventurous medical providers in the West or elsewhere that would want to set up shop on the islands to be the primary provider. But the fact that this hasn't happened actually points to almost a conscious avoidance of the provision of this sort of healthcare on the island, because having such facilities on the island means that current statistics will be collected about the prevalence of certain conditions. And with current statistics being collected, it will become very clear that the prevalence of cancers and the prevalence of the vestiges of nuclear testing is much higher than in other parts of the world. Then it becomes an accountability issue. So the fact that there aren't providers there is actually one way that I think this systemic means of avoidance is playing out today. It reminds me of how difficult it is to get a Geiger counter. Those little devices that measure radiation. I challenge anyone to try to get that past the airport in Mali or in Niger, to try and go to any of the uranium mining sites in Northwest Africa. You would literally either have it confiscated or you will be deported right at the airport, because of course having these Geiger counters and these pieces of technology at those mining sites is one way of collecting data about the exposure to radiation to such an extent that you have statistics that then make the French government accountable. So, these nuclear injustices are not a historical thing only, but they're continuing to today, and there's phenomenal amounts of suppression of information that is going on contemporarily. And I think accounts like Bedi's are extremely important to highlight that. The second thing I want to point out actually has to do with the Marshall Islands' refusal or reluctance to sign the TPNW in itself, because this is something that I don't think is only unique to the Marshall Islands, and I really appreciate that they're still holding back. And that is the formulation of Articles 6 and 7 and the placement of responsibility on the states that now govern places where nuclear testing took place. Why is it that France tested nuclear weapons in Algeria, but Algeria has to pay for it? Or the Soviet Union did the same in Kazakhstan, and now they have to pay for it. Or the US did the same in the Marshall Islands, and on and on and on. I feel that there is a flaw, a critical flaw in how Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW is formulated that hasn't really taken into account the historical and continuing vestiges of colonialism, because it seems as though those texts completely forgot that there was a change of authority, a change of sovereignty. And now these states that were tested upon are the ones that have to find the resources without placing explicit responsibility on the states that carried out the testing. And it's more problematic when you're dealing with states that carried out testing of weapons that were classified or secret, because a lot of the remediation that can be carried out today and a lot of the victim assistance relies on the kind of data that only those who tested the weapons have. How frequent was it? What was the chemical composition of the warheads? What were the meteorological data at the time of detonation that would help to better inform how fallout occurred? If we don't have these states that tested the weapons being extremely responsible, we wouldn't necessarily have the kind of data that we need for effective victim assistance or environmental remediation. So I just thought to put those 2 cents in about the impacts of colonialism today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'll let Bedi quickly respond on that, and then we'll move to the next kind of block of topics.
Thank you. I won't repeat what you said, but totally agree. And I just wanted to point out when Dr. Pavel was talking about how, there wasn't much awareness about the issue on victims. When I went to the MSP, I realized how little we know about the future impacts. And I realized everyone's talking about the future. We're talking about past and the current, what's happening now. And I think that discussion is really missing from the Pacific. A lot of people think that the nuclear issue is just, focused in the Marshall Islands, in Kiribati, in Fiji, in places that were impacted. They don't realize that everyone will be impacted. And so another practical solution is to, provide education, provide awareness and upscaling for youth who want to be involved in the disarmament movement. And throughout my work, I've met so many of them who are ready and passionate, but don't know where to go, don't know how to start. And in addressing Dr. Ola's statements on cancer, also investing in upscaling our medical, capabilities for young people who want to, study science and health and all of these things that could help us collect our own data. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll pose one last question to Pavel, and then I'll actually open it up to the questions that we've been collecting in the chat. We've had this discussion mainly now on, testing, and I think it's part of the, whole humanitarian agenda that has driven the TPNW a lot. And I would be curious, in your view, how this was discussed actually at the RevCon. So did this actually appear more often than at previous RevCons? So what impact did the TPNW have with regards to the whole humanitarian agenda, and how was the treaty itself discussed at the NPT. I think that's also something that someone asked in the chat, so I'm trying to feed in these questions already a little bit.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, as I said, I'm not a great kind of conference watcher, so I cannot give you the kind of the detailed account of the of all the discussions. And I think someone asked, I saw in the Q&A, how many states were mentioning the TPNW meeting. You have to kind of go into the record. Again, from what I've seen and what I've been getting from my colleagues was, of course, there was the fact that the TPNW is there. I mean, that was clearly a factor. Of course, everybody understood that there will be a resistance from the P5 and probably from their allies to not to mention, sort of not to refer to the TPNW in any. And then my understanding, again, and I talked to the people involved in the TPNW process and others. I think basically that was a conscious decision on the part of the TPNW states parties not to get into any confrontation over this because they especially after the first meeting in Vienna, the sense was that the meeting actually developed, made a strong statement. It developed an agenda. It created structure. And there was nobody saw a point of kind of asking for a recognition, if you will, from the NPT process, because people just realize that they don't need it, and it's not necessarily all that valuable to have some kind of a official recognition of any kind from the NPT states party. So that was my understanding of the process. So but again, this is a political. These are political processes, and of course, it is impossible to ignore the push, the drive, the work that TPNW states parties do in this area, in the area of victim assistance remediation, and it will, it will be serious part of the NPT, and not only in the NPT context proper, but as you may know, and that was also quite surprising, the number of observers who came to Vienna to participate, and again, it testifies to the power of the message, and I think a number of states, if I'm not mistaken, Switzerland, I think Norway also made a statement. Sort of the states actually are willing to work with the TPNW states on these issues, the remediation and victims assistance, and this is of course great, and that should be encouraged. As far as I know, everybody involved is very positive about this, and that's a good development. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So I think like you basically also answered very fully the whole question about how the TPNW was, viewed and discussed at the NPT. I have one more question, which is rather specific, which asks how many member states of the NPT during their statements have supported the TPNW, not counting those states that attended the one MSP. I think there's like the numbers probably nobody has, but just wanted to put it to the panel in case someone wants to pick up on that, just because it is sort of topically it matches the whole, you know, relationship TPNW NPT block. And I'll give you a minute to think about if someone wants to come in on that question. If not, we have quite a few questions actually about the whole complex of, you know, environmental remediation. And in that case, I will go to that block, but I will first give you a chance to respond to that question if there are responses to that. Does not seem to be the case. In that case, we'll move to the whole block of victim-assisted environmental remediation. And there is one question that I found quite interesting, which is to Olamide, which is about how is it necessary to develop nuclear radiation remediation strategies to protection against nukes use? So, Olamide, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I don't think we have sort of imagined post-nuclear use remediation in the future. I think particularly because we don't want to think of that as a possibility. I think the simplest answer that many organizations have put forward, the ICRC and ICAN, is that there really isn't anything. There isn't the capacity for any state to actually handle or cope with nuclear use in a conflict scenario. No single state, including the US, has the capacity to deal with the massive fireballs or the sort of infrastructural damage or the lack of communication infrastructure that would, follow a nuclear attack. There's just not the capacity. So, thinking of how there could be environmental remediation or victim assistance following a nuclear attack is almost in the realms of impossibility. I think definitely Professor Benoit Pelopidas would be quite proud of the fact that someone has thought so much outside the box to bring this sort of question of post-use to a discussion. But I don't think there's the capacity, and I doubt we can develop that in a reasonable time frame.
Thank you. Bedi, the next question goes to you specifically, and it reads, have you had the chance to connect with people affected from nuclear tests/attacks in other regions of the world? And will there be more organized international exchange between affected communities to combine their strengths? So I think that's also an interesting question to answer from your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. We actually do continue the discussion in our local and regional levels. Just recently this week, we had a discussion between faith leaders from Marshall Islands, Maui Nui, which is the French territory of French Polynesia, where they tested 193 nuclear weapons, and Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. So these discussions are ongoing, and we and our network of Pacific disarmament campaigners and nuclear justice advocates continues to work regionally and locally to form these partnerships, have more dialogue and discussion. And unfortunately, for places like Maui Nui, the amount of information available is, there are differences. So we're still trying to learn how to connect, how to reach out to one another and share all of the different issues that each of us are facing, but also share it within other places in the Pacific. So yeah, lots of discussions going on, lots of partnerships, and hope that we can continue to work together in international spaces. Often when we attend international spaces, we try to, find one another in our colorful clothing and flowers in our hair and make sure that we stick together. So it's really important to have those relationships.
Thank you. We're kind of like switching gear with the next question, because it is very much oriented towards, okay, how do we do this in practice? And I think that's like the question that, you know, the disarmament community has to face also. So like, we're talking about all this, but how do we get the reductions done, basically? And the question reads, how could European countries begin nuclear disarmament? And couldn't, for instance, France or Great Britain disarm completely without losing any strategic security vis-a-vis Russia or China? So bluntly speaking, what do France and Great Britain even need their nukes for? I'm sure most French politicians would bluntly disagree. So I'll put that to the panel. The person who asked that question actually put it to Pavel and Olamide. If either one of you wants to start answering this, that would be great. Who wants to go first? Pavel, go ahead.
Okay, let me try. Well, as I said, I told you that I do believe that Russia would be much better off without nuclear weapons. I think if you look at the UK, for example, today, you could make a strong argument that nuclear weapons actually are totally irrelevant to what's going on in that country and what will happen to it in the next how many years. France has this attachment to nuclear weapons that is hard to break, but I think that's also they've seen the limits of what these weapons can do. Again, the attempts of President Macron to negotiate with Russia before this invasion were not much better than attempts of other leaders. So it's not again there is this kind of attachment to nuclear weapons that sort of has its roots in history, but again, I think that the kind of careful look at what these weapons can do actually tells you that not much, and in fact they are they actually hold you back. Let me just give you again, looking at the war in Ukraine, which is the build up to the war in Ukraine, and that goes back to many years. In a way, what we've seen the security situation in Europe, the way it developed, was that like everybody or most people, let me put it that way, decided that, well, all we need to do is to get under the US nuclear umbrella and we will be fine. So, and to some extent, it is true for those who managed to get in. But the problem, of course, was that in this process, nobody really thought about building a robust security architecture. And this is not to say that it's all NATO expansion fault, because everybody has their share of responsibility, but that's what happened. And in the end, it ended up by creating conditions for the regime that currently exists in Russia to kind of grow and gain some strength. And and then you realize that, like, yes, nuclear weapons cannot do anything with this kind of a leadership. Or again, you look at North Korea. And as I said, I mean, everybody kind of was thinking, all the six parties and all that, everybody was thinking that, well, yeah, if they build nuclear weapons, we will deter them. We have our weapons, we will deter them. And so everybody let the situation deteriorate to the point when it did. So, and basically, again, my point is that yes, nuclear weapons are part of the larger structure of international security. They are important part, but they are not an essential part. And in fact, I would argue that they make everybody less secure in the end. So that would be my my take, I guess, my short, brief take.
Thank you so much for this. There are actually more questions on, like, when would Russia ever be, willing to disarm? But I somehow want to, like, put this aside because there's one more question that I want to put to Olamide before we, do the final statements of all three of you. And I want to make sure that we have time for this question, which is it says, it reads, I'm citing, the P5 tried to sabotage the TPNW in every way they can, but some allies, especially their civil societies, are more inclined to engage with the TPNW, for example, Germany. What does the global South expect from these countries, so allied countries, to promote the TPNW and nuclear justice? So I think that's actually quite interesting. So what is the expectation of the global South for allied states that are under the umbrella when it comes to, arms control, disarmament, and I'll put that to you, Olamide.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that is perhaps the most difficult question to get into because the answers are so complex. But if you permit me, I would like to first of all jump on the previous question because I think there's a segue to this current question about what the Global South expects. So the anonymous attendee asked, bluntly speaking, what does France and the UK need nuclear weapons for anyways? And he asked, or he or she, or they asked this question within the paradigm of, the UK or France disarming without losing strategic security vis-a-vis Russia and China. Now, if we change the paradigm of that question from losing strategic stability vis-a-vis Russia and China, because frankly speaking, France or the UK's arsenal is not anywhere comprehensive enough to survive a nuclear exchange of more than a first round or, maybe a short second strike. If we remove that strategic stability angle and think of it in terms of global prestige, then it begins to make more sense. The UK's option to, acquire the nuclear weapon, there was an article a colleague of mine at Third Nuclear Age was writing about the UK's, integrated review, and we're looking historically at the most significant rationale for UK's getting of the nuclear weapon, and it actually had to do with prestige. They sort of saw the nuclear option as one way of, protecting their colonial heritage. They were the big boys that had naval dominance throughout the entire world, and this is one way to sort of continue this vis-a-vis the rise of the US post the Second World War. It was a prestige issue. The facts, the technologies, the doctrines that the UK currently possesses for its nuclear arsenal does not make sense from a strategic stability point of view. And similarly, from a nuclear sharing point of view, Germany hosting US nuclear weapons, or Italy or Greece before they handed them back, or Turkey without any delivery mechanisms, is symptomatic of this same kind of delusion. Because the nuclear weapons that are being shared in Europe, the US nuclear weapons that are being shared in Europe, have no realistic prospect of being successfully detonated. In the sense that we're dealing with B-61 gravity bombs with, jet fighter delivery systems that are practically, very dated with regards to them being very easy to detect, to shoot down. There's no reasonable prospect of these bombs ever reaching their destination. So what are these bombs for? And frankly, these bombs are they're sort of held hostage by the idea that, no one realistically expects the US to give up New York for Warsaw, or, for some Eastern European city, under Article 5 obligations of the NATO treaty. So it's a way of forcing the US's hand to remain engaged with NATO and to keep the Article 5 obligations in the event of a nuclear exchange. But, as I'm explaining it, I hope it sounds as ridiculous as it actually is, because, it's not as though any of these states that are sharing the weapons can hijack these weapons and use them in a nuclear exchange, right? So the weapons are there and they're kind of useless because there's no codes and they can't be detonated. Now, Global South expectations, given the madness that I've outlined, I think it really boils down to two things from a Global South perspective. The first of which we have really highlighted, which is the issue of retributive justice. We like to talk about the world as though we're in this liberal international order where, democracy is on the rise, where every state has sovereignty and every state has the ability to chart its own path to the future, has the ability to develop itself. But the fact is that many states in the Global South are still being held down by many of the vestiges of colonialism, in terms of inequitable trade deals, in terms of the lack of technology transfer that they would need to develop. And now, given the climate crisis, many states in the Global South are very fearful that their options of developing in the future are becoming more and more restricted, precisely because many of the means through which Western states today develop are becoming stigmatized. You can't burn coal, you can't use oil, you can't, use all of these fossil fuels to develop your states anymore. Africa has to find a green means to, develop itself in the future. This is a place that is currently suffering under energy poverty. Now, rightly or wrongly, many of these states in the Global South feel as though the three pillars of the NPT have been completely ignored. So there was the promise to disarm, which never materialized on the first hand. There was, the Global South adherence to non-proliferation, which in exchange they were supposed to get nuclear technologies. They adhered to the non-proliferation mechanisms. They signed the IAEA's additional protocols, the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. But till today, how many states in the Global South have actually received any of the benefits of civilian nuclear technology? Very few. How is this connected to nuclear disarmament? Well, before the 1MSP in June, I tried to argue that there was a connection between the transfer of civilian technology and the developmental interests of states, especially in Africa, and the push for disarmament. And it was very difficult to argue. But if we go back to look at a lot of the statements that were made by Global South states in 1MSP, you would find, very interestingly, that many states in the MSP that is dealing with nuclear disarmament and nuclear weapons exclusively found a way to import language about their inalienable right to use nuclear technologies. So there is this trade-off here where Global South states are beginning to say, well, if we can't use civilian nuclear technologies for development, and if we have signed away our rights to, acquire nuclear weapons for the promise that Western states would disarm, and this didn't occur, then we're going to increase the pressure on every Western state to make sure that they disarm, just as a matter of principle. And there's many principles floating around in the nuclear politics space. And it's very interesting. So I definitely encourage you guys to look at those statements. So that's one way. Secondly, I think it's very difficult, almost hypocritical, and I apologize in advance, for Western civil society organizations to be preaching nuclear disarmament with free rein in the Global South because of the privileged access to leaders, to diplomats, to the upper echelon of Global South governments, without necessarily dealing with the issues they have at home. There's this statement that charity begins at home. But the nuclear disarmament discourse is dominated by Western civil society organizations, who, rightly or wrongly, have dictated, what nuclear disarmament should mean for the global South, right? And so I feel like Germany needs to get its act together. The Netherlands needs to get their act together in terms of having a very clear stance on nuclear disarmament, because it has to be proven that this is actually beneficial enough for these Western states to make a U-turn on their doctrines for the rest of the global South to see this campaign as credible. It's a very difficult point to bring out, but I think it's one that's very important to highlight. I'll pause there for now because that was a very long answer.
But a very interesting one. Thank you. I'll shorten a bit your final statement for that, Olamide. So we actually have to wrap up quite soon. My question to you, to the three of you, is now you have all the power in the world and you can dictate what the arms control and disarmament community puts on their agenda. So what are the key items the disarmament community has to focus on in the next 2 years, according to your personal perspective? And with that, we will end. And first, I'll let Bedi unroll her agenda.
I think I pretty much shared a lot of my thoughts on this already, but I'll just go ahead and reiterate the like I said, here in the Pacific, we focus on the past and everyone focuses on the future. And I think it's time for the global North to look back and provide, reparations, apologies, even some places we're not even acknowledged for the testing. So that's really important to us in the Pacific, and of course our capacity building and our environmental remediation and taking care of those really practical actions and how states can contribute to those actions. But yeah, just want to end give my final statement to say I learned so much today, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here and for all of the support that's being shown from ICAN Germany and all of the attendees and speakers. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Pavel, you're next.
Well, if I were if people would listen to me about what they should do, I would try to tell them that this is the message. I mean, to the extent I'm trying to kind of make to push that message in the public sphere to the extent that I can, through the media, through Twitter battles and all that. But I think the important thing we need to understand, again, that this is not about numbers. This is not about some kind of finding a balance or something. It is about making it clear, kind of internalizing the fact that nuclear weapons are weapons of mass murder. And this is what they are. And we should treat them that way. I mean, it has consequences and all that. And in my view, we need to do everything we can to delegitimize any and all nuclear threats, and build the structure that would not include these weapons, sort of. And I do believe that they are, in fact, as I said, they are not particularly useful. But they are still there as like physical objects and concepts and all that, and kind of breaking that structure is also is an important part of this disarmament enterprise. So once we realize that these are dangerous, useless objects, and they are dangerous, useless concepts, then we could start kind of getting rid of that. And from the technical side, there are no issues there. So you could do it like tomorrow. But it's all in the heads. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. And now all the agenda setting power for the next 2 years goes to you, Olamide.
It's actually very short, regardless of some of the criticisms or inconsistencies I've identified. I would say there's two things. First of all, we have to keep up the pressure because, as we've seen in the NPT RevCon, even just the mention of the TPNW there was quite significant. Something is working, and there's more and more signatory states. There's more and more member states of the TPNW, and so we have to continue to have additional states to such an extent that the German ambassador to the TPNW statement that the TPNW cannot be equated to customary law becomes an invalid statement. We need a majority of states in the world to sign on to the TPNW so that the argument can begin to be made that actually this is customary law because there's so many states that sign on to this. It's not just those that are party to the treaty that have to, accept the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And secondly, let us not return to the less diverse version of nuclear disarmament advocacy. And I say this with the understanding that the 2 MSP is going to happen in New York, in the US. It's ironic that we're holding MSPs in nuclear weapon states, where these states have the power to determine who is allowed and who is not allowed to enter the US to deliberate on disarmament. Right? We need to try to find the most accessible options to locate MSPs and review conferences, because we need that diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, and diversity of people in disarmament moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very concrete suggestion, actually, what can be done. Well, it's time to wrap up, actually. And I say sorry to the ones who couldn't have their question be posed to the panelists. We couldn't have them all, and I'm sorry about that, but I think we learned a lot, like Bedi said earlier. I'm incredibly thankful for all the panelists who shared their very diverse and very interesting views. I can just say I also learned a lot. And I want to thank ICAN for hosting this event. That's it, basically. I wish you all a lovely evening, or if you're not watching from Germany, Bedi to you, have a lovely day. And I hope we'll see you again soon in other events. And yeah, take care and goodbye, everyone.
Okay, well, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Komodava.